6 years ago on September 15th, 2015, my favorite game of all time launched called Undertale, but I didn't know it at the time. It wasn't until around 4 years later when the pandemic started that I actually got to pick up and play Undertale for the first time. And it would be an understatement to say that I fell in love with it. Despite only playing the game for around 10 hours, it's definitely my favorite game of all time just because it made me feel some certain way that I can't really describe, but I think everyone who's played Undertale knows what I'm talking about. The pacifist ending of Undertale just made me feel some sort of way that no other game has ever made me felt before, and I can guarantee you that a lot of people can relate to that. Now obviously I just finished Undertale and I see that a spiritual sequel is made to it called Deltarune. Obviously I started playing that and I definitely enjoyed Chapter 1. What made me enjoy Deltarune Chapter 1 even more was acknowledging that it wasn't going to be another Undertale. Toby Fox said himself that he doesn't think it can make you feel the way you felt when you beat Undertale ever again in any other game. I went into Deltarune Chapter 1 not expecting it to be another Undertale and I really enjoyed it this way. The only problems I really had with the game was the gameplay, and there really wasn't much of an incentive to spare enemies, which I think is an issue that Deltarune Chapter 2 really did a good job at fixing, but I'll be getting more into that later. Anyways, after finishing Chapter 1, there really wasn't much to do except just wait for the next chapter to come out. Unfortunately, the wait wasn't even that long. I only really had to wait a year and a half until I saw on Google News of all places that Deltarune Chapter 2 was coming out in the next 24 hours. Needless to say, I was ecstatic, especially because it was free, which I would have gladly paid $20 for Deltarune Chapter 2. I just like the series that much, but I'm still glad that it was free. Major props to Toby Fox for that. Now is where I'm going to start comparing Chapter 2 to Undertale and Chapter 1, and overall just reviewing Chapter 2. I'm not going to be covering anything past the first 20 or so minutes of the game, and I'm also going to be talking about main area where the game takes place, so if you consider those spoilers, then by all means check out right now. But if you don't consider the first 15 to 20 minutes of the game spoilers, then feel free to stay here. Now I'm going to be covering the big question that I'm sure everyone is thinking: is Deltarune Chapter 2 better than Undertale? In my opinion, no. Like I said before, I really don't think any game will make me be able to feel the same way I did when I played Undertale. However, there are definitely aspects of Chapter 2 that I would consider far superior to Undertale. For example, the humor. Undertale was a very humorous game and made me laugh a lot, but that doesn't even compare to how much Deltarune Chapter 2 made me laugh. There were so many laugh out loud moments when I was playing through that game. Maybe it's just me, but I definitely think that the writing and visual humor in Chapter 2 is far superior to Undertale in Chapter 1. I think it's hilarious, personally, but that might just be me. Now, the humor is pretty much the only thing I think that Chapter 2 does better than Undertale. Maybe the visuals. I think the visuals in Chapter 2 are superior to the visuals in Undertale. However, when we're comparing Chapter 2 to Chapter 1, I think Chapter 2 is superior in pretty much every way. First up, we're going to be comparing the atmosphere of the two games. I think that the atmosphere in Chapter 2 with the whole computer city thing is perfect. I might even consider the atmosphere in Chapter 2 to be superior to the atmosphere in Undertale. I think it's that good. So 100% the atmosphere in Chapter 2 is superior to the atmosphere in Chapter 1 though. There's no doubt about that. Next up, I'll be talking about audio. I definitely think the music in Undertale is better than the music in Chapter 2, but Chapter 2 definitely trumps Chapter 1 in terms of music. Chapter 2 just has so many bangers, the Queen's theme being the one that pops to mind immediately. That one is so good. Aside from just music, I think Chapter 2 has the best sound effects out of all the games. They're able to use sound effects really well to communicate great humor, and I really like that about the game. As an example, I really like the Susie and Lancer laugh track. Now, I know that's in Chapter 1, but I think it's used more effectively in Chapter 2 than it is in Chapter 1. Now is when I'm going to start talking about the plot, which I think is far superior to the plot in Chapter 1. I really didn't like the plot in Chapter 1 all that much, because a lot of it was theory, but the plot in Chapter 2 is so good. It was theorized that the world in Chapter 1 was make-believe, and this idea is built upon in Chapter 2. There's a section very early on in the game where you have to go and collect a bunch of clutter to bring to the dark world, and then those things turn to life, which really supports the idea that this whole game is kind of just make-believe, and I really like that they expanded on that aspect of the plot. They build upon this imaginative aspect throughout the game, and it's something I don't really fully understand, but I think MatPat's gonna have a blast making theories about this. But overall, I really like that they expanded upon this whole imagination aspect of the game. But that's really all I could say about the plot without getting into spoiler territory, so now I'm going to start talking about the characters. First up, I'm going to be talking about Rousey. In Chapter 1, I didn't really like him that much. He was just kind of like the side character that didn't really do much, kind of a little bit annoying. But in Chapter 2, he has a great personality, and I really think the fact that his face is showing really does it for me. Like, I like it a lot more now that his face is showing than before. I didn't like him as much. But I think his character is much more clear in this game. They kind of had something going in Chapter 1 where he was like this sensitive, kind person, but now it's really expanded upon, and I like it a lot more. Next up, we're going to be talking about Susie, and more specifically, the dynamic between Susie and Noelle. Susie's arc from the first game is expanded upon into this game, where in the first game, she was kind of this rude, mean character, insensitive, and then she becomes kinder towards the end of the game, and that continues here, where she's more of a kind character in the beginning of the game, and then throughout the whole game, you really see her kindness shine, especially with Noelle. Noelle is this deer sort of creature that joins you in the dark world, and her and Susie kind of have a thing going on. And it's really interesting to see Susie's kind side show more in this game than in the first game, so I really think that's a great aspect. Susie's dynamic and character development, really great. Next is by far my favorite character in Chapter 2, the Queen. Whenever the Queen's on screen, she just completely steals the show. So if you don't know, the Queen is the ruler of this new dark world that the characters travel into. The Queen very heavily relies on internet humor, and I think the execution here is perfect. Toby Fox, or whoever on his team wrote the Queen's character, the comedy is just so fantastic. Pretty much every time she's on screen, I'm laughing. If the Queen wasn't in Deltarune Chapter 2, or her character wasn't as focused on comedy, I would not think Deltarune Chapter 2 is funnier than Chapter 1 or Undertale. I think that shows just how good of a character she is. The Queen also has a right-hand man that she doesn't really like, and his name is Birdly. Birdly is an egotistical bluebird with his mind set on being smart. He tries to suck up to the Queen, who finds him to be extremely obnoxious. The relationship between them is downright hysterical. Like in Undertale in Chapter 1, the gameplay is phenomenal. New to Chapter 2 is the recruit feature. The player can now recruit enemies to their home if enough of that enemy are spared. This is a wonderful addition that gives a great incentive to spare enemies. Speaking of sparing enemies, the acts are as fun and unique as ever. Overall, the gameplay is one of Deltarune's strongest aspects. With most of the main characters out of the way, I'll briefly be mentioning the boss fight, but I won't say any spoilers, just my opinions on the boss fight. I think it's excellent, way better than the Chapter 1 boss fight. Obviously, it can't compare to the Azrael fight in Undertale, like, let's be real here, but it definitely is better than Chapter 1. I think it's a phenomenal boss fight. And that's really all I could say about it without discussing spoilers or anything. Overall, I would give Deltarune Chapter 2 a 4 out of 5. I think it's way better than Chapter 1 in pretty much every way, but it doesn't make me feel the same way that Undertale did, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I definitely can't say I liked it more than Undertale. With that being said, all that's left to do is wait for Chapters 3 to 5 release. If you still haven't played Deltarune's first 2 chapters, what are you doing? They're free, go play them. This has been Matt with Game Domain, signing out. See you in the next video.